Welcome back to From the Belly. I'm Doug Wheeler, and as I say at every episode, I am just really proud uh, to be I guess you would say, the owner and operator of this podcast. We are in a new season where the theme of our work is addressing the issue of church, and we're coming at it from the angle of being hopeful about church, trying to embody people's suspicion and cynicism about church. And so this isn't a podcast just to talk about all the great things about church. It's really to talk about the reality of how the church sits in, especially this country, but also how people experience the church inside and outside of it. So our topic is, why not church? Or maybe, why church? And so that why church can come from people who've never experienced church or had some really bad experiences with it. So, with no longer ado, I am honored to have Ken Wheeler with us today. Yes, we share the last name. I reached out to Ken on Facebook. I was telling a person the other day when they said, "Well, how do you get all these great guests?" I said, "Well, I go fishing on Facebook." Maybe that's not the best way but I found a good fishing hole on Facebook, and I just reach out to people. And some people I never hear from, and some people say, "Yeah, I'll have a Zoom call with you." Well, it happened quick with Ken. So Ken, thank you so much for saying yes. We've had a few conversations that we become friends and getting to know each other. But I like to come into this, unless I know the guest prior, I like to come in with less knowledge, because it gives me that inspiration of, gosh, tell me who you are and tell me about your life and tell me how you operate in the world. So Ken, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Doug. It's good to be here.
Yeah. So let me read a short bio on Ken. There's a longer version, but as I say in most episodes, Ken and I were chatting about this earlier this morning, is that, when you would go and hear somebody teach or make a presentation, and then they might have captivated your interest, your focus, and then they started reading off of the PowerPoint. And you'd be like, well, we can read that. I mean, tell us something novel. We can read what's behind you there. So I think of that sometimes when I used to read people's bios, and I would look at the guest, and they look sometimes uncomfortable and maybe even bored. So I thought, I'm just going to give a little bit. So let me read a little bit about Ken, and then you can fill it in, Ken, with anything more that you feel is pertinent to our time. Ken Wheeler is a retired ordained pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. He is a sought-after preacher, public theologian, and writer. Ken is an in-demand preacher for the national observance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. Most of his writings, sermons, and lectures focus on faith, race, and social justice. Ken Wheeler is a respected elder and mentor to young pastors and seminarians, a native of Jackson, Mississippi. Pastor Wheeler earned a BA in religion from Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota, and an M.DIV from Trinity Lutheran Seminary in Columbus. Again, Ken, we're really honored to have you here. I also want to mention a book that you wrote that's on my book list. It's going to be coming soon. You published the book in 2022, and we'd love to be able to hear some of your thoughts about that. What that experience was like for you to write it, what you learned in your writing, and even comments that you've gotten from people. But the title of the book, excuse me for a minute while I find my notes here, is An Evangelical Pastor's Cry, Alarm, and Warning. The official title is U.S., The Resurrection of American Terror. Is that U.S. or is that us?
Either way.
Either way. Wow. I see that. I do want to, before I give Ken an opportunity to start where he wants to start this morning, I picked up something off your Facebook. And again, it's where we met. And I screenshot it because I thought I want it for this morning, and I want it for some of my own thinking and some of my own personal work. You said this: maybe the reason that our pews in churches are empty is because we have served an eviction notice on people's hope, their peace, their trust in the church. And then you had ... more. So there's more to say about that. So that's a great time to say, Ken, take it from here.
Yeah, actually, that quote was from my pastor, Timothy Chambers. And by the way, I live near East St. Louis. It is a True Light Baptist Church, is a historic Black Baptist church in the city of East St. Louis. And my wife and I joined that congregation about 11 years ago. And I have to say, as I said to my pastor not long ago, that it was a delight to be in a congregation where I felt safe as an African American person. And I said that because in this climate today, even though I grew up in the Lutheran Church, I served as a pastor in that church for 30 years. In today's climate, I am not absolutely certain that I would be safe in some of the congregations across this country. And so, as I was reading that article, and that the quote that you read was from an article that he wrote in a local newspaper. In fact, he has a weekly column that deals with the church. Why our pews are empty. And I would add that I think some of the reason, in fact, a large part of the reason that our pews are empty is because we have to deal with this thing called church hurt. A lot of churches, a lot of people have been hurt by the church, hurt by the church's theology, hurt by the church's preaching, particularly I think of those who are in the LGBTQIA community. Um, and so it leads me to rethink. And I think the whole church needs to begin to rethink. When we say that we believe in Jesus, what do we mean by that? Because the Jesus that I read, the story of Jesus that I read, that are contained in the four Gospels, speaks of a Jesus who is inclusive, who understands that word in a way that we haven't quite grasped. God so loved the world, and he did not make any exceptions. He loved all people, regardless of their race, regardless of their nationality, regardless of their gender, regardless of their sexual identity. And I think when we begin to raise up exceptions, then what we have done is to reduce the gospel. We have made the gospel less than what the gospel is. Now, I was preaching in a church, Doug, a couple of years ago. This was in relation to my book, and I had raised up my text for that Sunday, and this was a predominantly white Lutheran congregation. The church was packed. There were about 20 African Americans who were present in that church. And so the text that I was preaching from was Galatians chapter 1, where Paul is kind of chiding the Galatian church as other voices have creeped in to the church, saying that that the gospel is not sufficient, that in order to be a Christian, one has to be circumcised, because he's talking to Jews. One has to be circumcised. And Paul is quite disturbed. And so he writes in that first chapter, if anyone comes preaching to you another gospel, let that person be cursed by God. And so as I was moved to preach about white supremacy, I said clearly that white supremacy was another gospel. And anyone who comes preaching that gospel should be cursed by God. And I asked the question, I wasn't expecting an answer. It was a rhetorical question. How in the world could 81% of white evangelicals vote for someone like Donald Trump? Given his moral character, given the way in which he talked about black folks and how he treated women. And this person stood up and actually answered, holding up one finger, and said loudly enough for the congregation to hear, I am a Trumper. And he stood up the entire time that I was preaching, holding up his finger. And I turned in his direction. And I said to my wife as we were flying back to St. Louis on that Monday, I know that the Spirit of God was with me, because I did not get angry. I don't even know how I turned in that direction. I just knew that I turned in his direction. And I said, let me share with you what we in this room, all of us in this room who claim a faith in Jesus Christ, profess. The first, and these things are foundational. The first is that we are all created in the image of God. That's foundational. Created in God's image and in God's likeness. And then God said, um, steps back and he says about humanity, it is good. That every human being that God creates is good. There is nothing alien. There is no aberration in any human being that God has created. And secondly, I said, we believe that God is a God of love. That's foundational. And then I quoted from John's gospel, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whoever believes in him should not perish. And then he goes on to say that Jesus came into the world, not to condemn the world, but that the world might have life, and that that gift of life is for everybody. Whether you are black, whether you are white, whether you are Asian, whether you are LGBTQIA, abundant life for everybody, because that's God's desire and that's God's intention. Thirdly, I said, and anyone who claims to be a white supremacist, anyone who latches on to that is an enemy of God and is an enemy of Jesus Christ. And then I remembered the quote from James Baldwin, who said that our faith in God, just the very idea of God, he said, the very idea of God ought to enlarge us as human beings, ought to make us better as human beings. And if our God does not do that, then it's time for us to get rid of that God. I think we are in a critical moment in this country, not just politically, but I think we are in a critical moment theologically when we have churches in our nation, not unlike some churches in Germany during Hitler's reign, who believed in and who supported the ideology of Nazism. Those churches were wrong-headed and they were headed in the wrong direction. I think that any church in this country, in America today, that supports Trumpism is a church that is drinking water that is polluted, and it's dangerous.
Wow, Ken, you still got me inside of that sanctuary or that chapel or that parish you were at. I'm still in there,
Yeah,
feeling what you were feeling, and I don't know what you were feeling, but I know what I would have been feeling sitting there. I'd like you to talk more about white supremacy, and there's a line that I heard from a song recently that really, to me, and a lot of times song lyrics will read like a poem. It's got very, very minimal lyrics in the song, and it really stood out to me. I'd heard the song many times, but boy, it hit me right between the eyes. People are what people make them. People are what people make them. And he goes on to say, essentially, if you think you can change that, you're a fool.
yeah,
So I'm thinking about that, like the permanency of, for example, the individual that stood up with his finger in the air. You know, you and I could have a theological conversation with him that it would only become a war of
yeah,
debate because he
yeah,
would be able to fight back with all the verses that he has decided. And now he's zealous for God, not
yeah,
unlike somebody like you and I who would be zealous for the God that you present and the God.
yeah,
So people are what people make them.
yeah,
One of the things that stood out when you and I were getting to know one another a week or so ago, and it stands out about your book, is um, white supremacy and the pain that you've experienced. I'm imagining also you knew those few African Americans in that white congregation, what they were experiencing, because you were clearly in the minority. But can you talk to us about white supremacy, the roots of this, that I know that they manifest in theological perversions, but people are what people make them. Can you
yeah.
talk about that, Ken?
Yeah, let me go back into that church with you
Please do.
because after the service was over, this individual made a quick exit. So he did not cut, and he went through the side door, didn't come through where most of the folks were leaving, and my wife and I had a chance to greet folks. The pastor took us out to lunch, and the pastor's white, took us out to lunch. He had been described as a liberal to me. I did not know him before preaching there. So my wife and I and the assistant to the bishop, one of the assistants to the bishop who drove us that weekend, went to lunch. And the pastor said, and this bothered me even more than the man standing up protesting. The pastor defended him. And in fact, he said, well, he's a good person. He does a lot of good for people in the community. And I stopped and I said, well, I don't buy that. I'm not going to sit here and allow you to pour salt into a wound that's already open. And we've normalized white supremacy to the degree that if you're white, you don't hear the offense. And so when I think about how this thing came to be, this ideology, which dates all the way back to the 15th century, a group of people who thought that they were superior to another group of people simply by virtue of the color of their skin, right? Something that started off as an ideology, but that ideology grew into an economy. Slavery grew out of that white supremacist ideology. And the people that were being enslaved were seen not as human beings, but they were seen as commodity, property. And so in the book, I'm a student of history, and so I learned early on the words of Thomas Jefferson's, at least that part of the Declaration of Independence that we all cite, that every human being is created in God's image and is endowed with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I understand that when Thomas Jefferson wrote those words, as brilliant as they are, as aspirational as they are, when he wrote those words, he owned 200 slaves. And so when I say that, I think about how I feel when I even speak that language. To be owned. You are a human being, but you are owned by another human being. So the Bible says, Genesis 26 and 27, there in the text, God says, we are created in God's image and in God's likeness. And what white supremacy does is to say, no, it is supremacy remakes us in human image. And that human image is determined by people who are white. And that's the perversion. That's the sin. And it's a powerful thing to think that you can own another person, or to see that person not as a human being. The crises that we are in today, and we've been in for a long time, in my estimation, is that we have lost sight of what it means to be human. I argue in my book that white supremacy not only hurts folks of color, but it also hurts white people. Because what white supremacy does is to fill you with the false narrative, the false notion that you are somehow better than, superior than someone who is Black or Asian because of your white skin. And that is simply not true. White supremacy robs you as a white person of the ability to be in touch with your own humanity.
And Ken, when you and I were talking a few days ago, if I get any of this wrong, please correct me. You were talking about the church at the time of Martin Luther King Jr., and then you referenced the church today, and that you just said it a few minutes ago, that we're at a crossroads, if you will. And I guess one could argue that we're always at that crossroads, but is there something unique or special? I don't think that's the best word. Is there something unique about this crossroads we're at, the church in America, let's say?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. If you read the book, I grew up in the South. I grew up under Jim Crow. I lived under that system for 17 years until I went away to college. I grew up when Ross Barnett was the governor of Mississippi, and Ross Barnett and George Wallace, who was the governor of Alabama, were like two peas in a pod. They believed firmly in segregation. They fought to keep their states segregated. They fought to keep white people in power. I point out in the book that Ross Barnett was a Sunday school teacher, and Ross Barnett taught his Sunday school class that God was a segregationist. And the proof for that, he says, is that if God had not been a segregationist, he would have put all of us in the same space. Instead, he put black people in Africa.
I see.
And he put white people in Europe, right? Because he meant for white people and black people to be separated. Now, can you imagine that he's teaching this in a Sunday school class? What I say about Donald Trump, because this is the uniqueness that we find ourselves in today. This is what makes this completely unique for us, is that we have a president. I've heard worse things in my life from Ross Barnett, from George Wallace, but I've never been alive when a president of the United States has made white supremacy and racism a policy. And so he changes the game completely. He changes the game completely. This is evil. That's all I can say. That's the best word that I can use to describe what this feels like, what it's, I know, and those of us who are of a certain age, I'm 73, those of us who are a certain generation, those of us who grew up in the South in particular, know what racism looks like. We also know what it feels like, right? There were white people who used to say to me, Ken, you shouldn't take it so personal. And I would say, what do you mean I shouldn't take it so personal? I take it personal because it is personal, right? What Donald Trump and his administration are doing in this moment, I take personal. And that's why this is so painful to me. And that's why this is so necessary for us as Americans who love this country, who love the idea of this country, who love democracy. We need to be speaking up and we need to be speaking out. We need to be upholding the values. Let's reach back and let's lift up those words of Thomas Jefferson, even if he didn't mean what he said. The idea of his words have their own power. We are all created in God's image, and God has created us with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that word inalienable means that they are rights that no one can take from us.
Thank you, Ken. I've got question. It's got two parts to it. What question or questions would you welcome from a white person, a group of white people in a predominantly white church? And then the second question is, but it's a companion question, somebody on the street who's white that cares about the community, cares about their neighborhood, maybe does a lot of acts of good service, but doesn't attend church.
Yeah.
What questions do you want those white individuals to ask you?
Yeah. Well, that's really a good question. And I would say right off the bat, my first question would be, why is it so difficult for you to embrace my humanity? Why is it so difficult for you to see me as a human being, or for people who look like me as a human being? Why is that so difficult? Why do we constantly need to defend ourselves, to defend our humanity, to defend our right to even live in this country? This, I think it's interesting that we refer to ourselves as African American, and there's a hyphen, right, that separates those two, African hyphen American. And the hyphen says a lot. It says that we have not been fully accepted in this country, right? And even though we refer to ourselves as African, the place of our origin, most of us, the majority of us, have never set foot on the shores of the continent, right? So we may feel like strangers there, as well as we are strangers in the land that we know best. We know America best. We know we don't know Africa as well. So when I went to Africa in 2000, I stayed with 3 families. And the first family that I lived with, Mr. Urea was a farmer, and so I was in their home, and his wife was preparing supper, and his mother was there, and she was sitting in a recliner, and I was sitting in a chair next to her, pretty close to her, because she had my hand, and she was rubbing my hand, and she was looking directly at me, but she was asking the question in her native language, which was Meru, not Kiswahili. Her son spoke both languages as well as English. But she was asking me through her son, how did you, Ken Wheeler, how did you, an African, get to America? This lady was 95 years old. How did you, an African, get to America? And as she was rubbing my hand, she said to me, you are at home. You are welcome. I will never forget that. But that would be a question that I would want to ask white Americans. Why? Why don't we feel
Mhm.
at home here?
Boy, her question prompts, well, first of all, just I feel so touched by the way you told that story. Was she making commentary, Ken, on that Ken Wheeler, you've been dislocated.
Yeah,
You went somewhere that you either uh, have proven to not belong, or
yeah,
you never should have gone in the first place. So come home. I don't know. If I
yeah,
read that in a novel and it didn't give me a lot of explanation and it was story
yeah,
based, I think I would just be wondering about what
yeah,
she said so much in that question.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and so I was asked that question. So there were 12 of us who went initially,
Mm,
and my colleague, Mr. Vivian Thomas Brightfell, and I were the only 2 African Americans in the delegation. And so we spoke at 4 schools, and then we would get that question in various ways. How did you, an African, get to America?
get to America.
Yeah. And then the second part of that was, why don't you come home? These were from the school children. Why don't you come home and teach? We will build you a house for you
Mm,
and mama, meaning my wife. We
my
will
wife.
build you a house for you and mama. Come and teach. And so I asked the bishop of the
Mm,
diocese, don't they know about slavery? And he said,
mm.
yes, they do. He said, yes, they do, but they don't know what happened to the slaves once they got to America. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Boy, it's almost as if that 95-year-old woman could intuit
yeah,
something. It's almost as if she knew
yeah.
that you've been dislocated,
That's right.
i.e.,
That's
mistreatment.
that's right.
This question just keeps coming, and I really invite honest dialogue on this podcast. So if this doesn't hit you well, or you want to tell me how it hits you, but I feel compelled to ask it, it just keeps coming.
Yeah,
How are you not full of hatred? How are you not full of hatred?
yeah, yeah. You're the second white person who's asked me that question, and I have to say, and I think I say this in the book. I grew up under Jim Crow. I knew the ugliness of that, but I also grew up in a Christian home with a Christian mother, and who didn't just talk about her faith, she lived her faith. And every morning, we didn't have an alarm clock, so when I was going to school, my mother woke up every morning at 5 o'clock. And I would wake up because I would hear her pray. And she would sit at the kitchen table and she would start out each day reading the Psalms and she would pray. And we lived in a 4-room house, but those prayers fill that house with the glory of God. It's the only way that I can describe it. And I used to, when I got older, I never talked back to my mother, but I wondered how she could be so patient. And she would say to me, son, you just have to trust God and that God will work this out. And, I didn't, that answer didn't sit well with me,
I'm sure.
but I didn't argue with my mother. I listened, right? And I heard this woman praying every day. And then she would end her prayer with this petition. God, I want you to watch over my son. I want you to keep him from all hurt, harm, and danger. Every black mother in the Georgetown community, every black mother, every black father knew about the death of Emmett Till. And so when my mother was praying that prayer, although I didn't quite get it, she had and they had that act of violence in their and so I think my mother introduced me to a Jesus, to a God who was a God of love. And I've struggled with that.
Yeah, sure.
But I've held on to that. And so that it's hard not to hate. I won't sit here and say that I've not thought about that. It's hard not to hate. But I also happen to believe in this God, and I believe in this Bible. I believe in this Jesus that that I'm confronted with, particularly in the Gospel of Matthew. I say that Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew is at his most radical self when he says, it's easy to love your neighbor. It's easy to love people who are like you. It's easy to love people who are in close proximity. But he says, but what good is that? You ought to also have love for your enemy, right? And as I wrestle with that, I think Jesus knew that if we did not love our enemy or learn to love our enemy, we would become just like the enemy.
Yeah.
Right.
Gosh, Ken, thank you. When I hear that, and now I'm inspired to go read through the book of Matthew. But what I hear when you read that or when you quoted that, I thought Jesus wasn't saying that it's not good to love one another, those that are like you, but it's not good enough.
Right.
It's good.
Yeah.
But it's not good enough.
It's not good enough. It's not good enough. And so, I have never referred to, let me tell you, I struggled with Donald Trump in his first term. I came really close to hating him, if I can use that word.
Oh, sure, sure.
And so I struggled, I had to go back and wrestle with Jesus's words there. But I never, and because I heard Jesus's words, I never ever referred to Donald Trump as 45 because he had a name, right? And Donald Trump was created in God's image as well, right? And so I may not want to sit in the same room with him, but I don't want, Paul says that when you love your neighbor, you will never seek to do your neighbor harm. Right? So I don't harm on him, but I don't need to be in the same room as he is.
Right.
Right.
Ken, you served in the city of Milwaukee, and we had a nice chat about how I'd traveled all over the world and had never been to Milwaukee, but went there within the last few years. You were there for 28 years. You no longer live there.
Right.
Would you tell us a little bit about you living in that space and time for 28 years? That was your world.
Yeah.
And then I think you had mentioned to me earlier before the podcast about what one political individual did to that city and what changed. And I think it's pertinent to what we're talking about here. Would you share some of that?
Yeah. You mean when we were talking about the governor?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. And his name is Scott Walker. Scott Walker was a Republican who was running for governor at the time, campaigned all over the state, never came to Milwaukee, and in fact, in an interview, referred to Milwaukee as the armpit of the state because Milwaukee, the predominant population of Milwaukee is black. And so he never came to Milwaukee, never came to the black community, never spoke to anybody in the black community. But that was his attitude. And that was the attitude of many Republicans outside of Milwaukee. And so when we talk about, white supremacy, it's dangerous, particularly when a person is in office or sits in a place of power, when their attitudes begin to shape policy. Donald Trump sits in the Oval Office as President of the United States. He is one of the most powerful people in the world. And by the stroke of a pen in the first week, by the stroke of a pen, he deconstructed 60 years worth of hard work that many, many people fought for and died for in terms of changing this nation into a more perfect union. And in 1 week, he deconstructed that. He also, by the stroke of a pen, declared that there are only two genders, male and female, that there people who are trans simply do not exist. And so I was speaking to a group in Iowa, and I said, let's talk about connections. Because one of the things that we fail to do when we teach history is to connect the dots. And I said, so how many of you remember the Supreme Court decision, Judge Taney, who declared in the Dred Scott decision that Black people had no rights that white people had to respect? In that same ruling, he declared that Black people were not citizens of this country. Therefore, they had no rights to be respected. Come to 2025, and Donald Trump, by the stroke of a pen, did exactly what Judge Taney did uh, for folks who were trans. Trans people exist. They are a reality, right? PQIA people exist. Their presence is real. And no matter what document you sign, no executive order can erase that person's humanity or their reality. Push that further theologically. If we are created in God's image, and I believe that we are, all of us, I believe that we are. All of us are created in God's image. And if that is true, it means that that image is so deep, the imprint of God is so deep in all of us that no human being, no human power can erase that.
Sounds like that's, I won't rank the things that you stand on as primary to you, but it sure sounds like if I were to go through, which I don't, if I were to go through and edit line
Yeah,
by line, word by word, boy, there's just a constant. You return to that place.
yeah,
Ken, let me ask you this, and I'll set it up this way. I didn't grow up in a Christian home.
yeah.
I think I shared some of this with you before, and I've shared some of this, and I won't go into great detail because don't need to, and people have heard some of this. So it's interesting. I find myself so often, now that I've returned to church, it's back up and running in me. I went through a time of intentionally deconstructing some of my belief system and my faith, and then with the death of my brother, I think I'd mentioned this to you. It was a head-on collision or a side swipe like a car accident that it literally just shattered any faith that I had.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, what came with that, and I was already in the place of not sure about church. And at that time, and this is just the way I tend to operate. I couldn't hold on to certain elements of my faith. It just all got buried, and I was just done with it. I said to one person, this conversion experience that I've kind of grounded it's where it all started for me because I didn't grow up in a Christian home, so I didn't
Yeah,
have that. The grounding place for me was I was an 18 and a half, almost 19-year-old individual who was, I say, lost in the sense of, I don't even think eternally in salvation. I mean, my lostness was I'm hopeless, not hopeless because of some existential. It's just like my life's not working. Things are falling apart. I've got this suicidal ideation. I've got tons of anxiety. I don't know why I feel so down. So that's the way I came to have this encounter with Christ,
yeah,
which is very profound for me. But I was at the point a few years ago of just saying I'm suspect of that. I think that was just a young man grasping for something, and somebody could have handed me something else, and I would have grabbed a hold of that. But I grabbed a hold of the gospel. I
yeah,
never really firmly believed it, but I really tried to just extinguish all that inside of me. Now that I've returned to church, what I've noticed is some of this bad, I'll call it theology and ways that got into my system. I feel like I've been purged of that. I've returned back, but there's one thing that stayed with me, and it's on my mind this morning. I often think about the person who has a lot of beef with the church,
yeah,
or is in the neighborhood and just goes, I don't know much about it, but I don't see much value in it. But now that I read the newspaper and I read the internet, I just go, man, you that's just wacky. That's just whatever. You guys are fighting all this stuff and Christian nationalism, whatever. So I'm thinking this. If you meet somebody in the community, they get to know you and you begin to have lunch with them. and they're not a person of faith or church,
Mhm.
but they
Mhm.
ask you one day as they get to know you. They're a really astute listener, and they're very intrigued by you, and you just connect with them and you become friends. And they ask you one time, so Ken, tell me this: what value does this Bible that you read, that really is in essence, it's the book of the church,
Yeah.
what use does that book have, and what use does church have in this day and age? Because I, as a person of no faith, look at your Bible, and I've even tried to read it, and it seems like it feeds at least a stream of the violence that we're up against.
Yeah.
So, how do you hold on to the book? What use does the book have? And the church that you speak of, that you've given your life to, what use? Wouldn't it be
Yeah.
good if all of that was just eradicated,
Yeah.
just gone, and we still had people trying to do good things and whatever? You know what I'm getting at. What
Yeah.
use does this book
Yeah.
have? This problematic book.
Yeah. And what that's an excellent question. And it is problematic, right? And if you believe, as some people do, that God is a God of judgment. I used to watch this show called Maud, and Maud would always say, God is going to get you for that, right? Uh,
You're right. Yeah, I know the show.
yeah, and
That
so
dates us, doesn't it, Ken? That dates
yeah,
us.
and so her view of God was of this thing that you should be fearful of, right? I used to ask my students in confirmation, is it enough to believe in God? And they would say, yeah. And I would say, I beg to differ. The devil believes in God, right? The people who blew up the Twin Towers, they believed in God. But Jesus redefines God. He's not a God of judgment, but he's a God of love. And so if I'm sitting with a stranger, first of all, I think it's most important to hear their story. It's to listen to them. And usually I do that without commentary, but to get to know them, right? When I went to Cross Lutheran Church, the community minister said to me, Pastor, when are you going to start teaching the Bible class, the Wednesday Bible class? And I said to him, well, I plan to do that, but not until I have spent 6 months, at least 6 months, getting to know the community. So I'm down there every Wednesday, and I'm moving from table to table, and I'm hearing people's stories, because it will not be until then that I feel worthy enough to even share a word about God. And so I did that. And I so why don't I hate? Why am I not filled with hatred? It's because I take seriously this God revealed by Jesus to be a God of love. I will never be able to change Donald Trump, right? He doesn't know who I am, doesn't know that I exist, right? I will never be able to change people who think like Donald Trump. But I'm not going to allow their hatred to impact the way that I live. I hope that I will continue to be a caring, gracious, kind, non-judgmental person until the day I die. You know, let me when you spoke about your brother, did your
Yes.
brother committed suicide?
Yes.
Yeah. And so when you shared that with me, I thought of something that Maya Angelou said. She said, when we are in a place of grief, we are at our most human self, because we can't hold on to anything but our humanity. And when I spoke of church, people being hurt by the church, there was a time in the church where if one took his or her life, those folks were condemned, right?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
There was no grace, right? I don't ever want to be I don't ever want to play God, right? As a pastor or as a Christian, I don't ever want to do that. I don't have the power to do that. Whether I hope that I will get to heaven, but that's not in my hands. That's not my decision. That's God's decision. Donald Trump may make it to heaven before I do. The Bible is clear about that, right? Because it's all a matter of grace. And the Although I disagreed with my mom a lot about how she lived her faith, the one thing that became crystal clear to me was that this woman was just a person of such magnanimous grace. Eighth grade education. She worked as a domestic. I never heard my mother say a negative word about white people
Wow.
at all. Right, not one word. And I
Wow.
knew, and I know that she suffered some, and my father suffered some things that I never suffered as a result of living in that system. And so I have to ask, how was she able to do that?
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, it's interesting that you bring your mother back up because there's a part of me that's still witnessing you in the house, listening to your mother pray at the table. Ken, I want your take on something as a former pastor and still pastoring people. So I've started reading the book of First John recently,
Yeah,
and I came across a I don't know about the way maybe it's true for the way all of us read. You read something and you know some segment of your brain says that ought to really stand out to you, that ought to really reach you, and for some reason it doesn't, it
yeah,
doesn't mean you don't believe it, it doesn't mean it doesn't mean something, but it's just kind of like okay. Two things that have stood out to me, and I'm not through with the book First John. One was that the writer is urging this audience to abide, and what I heard in it for the first time was, if you don't abide, then the truth won't abide in you. And I didn't interpret that as that means that you're not with God, and it means that you're divorced from God, and eternal stuff. I didn't read it like that. I just read it as you're alive. If you don't abide, then the truth won't abide in you.
yeah,
And so there's this intentionality, and we could then talk about what does it mean to abide, and how do you do that. But I was thinking about that. But the second thing that struck me, man, I was telling my wife about this because my wife was, if she listens to this podcast, she might say, "Why did you bring that up?" And I'll say, "I don't know." Well, I brought it up because I had a point. But
yeah,
she was just telling me, we spent the day together on Monday, and she said, this was a conversation, but this is a little excerpt from it. She said, I'm so sick and tired of people telling me how to live. And, of course, on the internet, you read this and it's an expert, and you read this and they'll heal you from this, and read this and they'll teach you this and all this. And she said, I'm saturated.
yeah,
I think what I heard her saying was, I can't even hear my own voice.
yeah,
I can't even hear my own interior
yeah,
world because
yeah,
it's so saturated.
yeah,
So we talked about, just the saturation and also just how to take a break from it. But in First John, the writer says explicitly, I mean, I don't think that one can kind of go, well, you can kind of read that a certain, I mean, he literally says, you don't need any teachers.
yeah,
And he speaks about this anointing.
yeah,
Now, for me, that word, a lot of these Christian words have always, I mean, they're trigger points, they
yeah,
mean something or whatever. It's like, okay, anointing some special thing, and now you're some special person of God, and you've got this
yeah,
anointing. But that's not what he's saying.
yeah,
He's saying is you've received this anointing,
yeah,
this inner awareness and connection with God. You don't need anybody to teach you.
yeah,
The anointing, the Spirit will teach you. And what do we do with that? Because
yeah,
we read books, and I say, wow, this person. I was going to ask you a few minutes ago, what are some of the theologians that you're currently reading that are just part of your formation, that it seemed like they'll always be, or you just came upon them? But then I thought, you know what? What about this whole thing of we don't need a teacher?
yeah, yeah.
I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I love that. So Marcus Borg is a New Testament scholar,
I
and
know Marcus Borg.
so he talks about Jesus as a spirit man. And it's interesting that, when you read, particularly the Gospel of Luke, where the Spirit is all over the place, as with the gospel, with Acts,
Mm,
the Spirit is all over the place. Jesus was led into the wilderness by the Spirit.
mm,
Jesus was baptized, and the Spirit of God. So I think John is simply saying that we are all spirit people. If Jesus lives in us, we are all spirit people. And the challenge is to listen to that spirit, to listen to that voice, right? Howard Thurman talks about, making sure that we are paying attention into our interior selves. And I think that's what John is getting at.
He's getting that.
Yeah, he's getting at that. So abide, uh, abide in love, right?
Mm.
If you abide in love, you abide in the truth. Abide in love. If you abide in love, you abide in me. Where love is present, there is no darkness. There is only light. How can one say that they love God whom they have not seen and yet hate their sister or brother whom they have seen?
Wow.
And if they say that, they are a liar and the truth does
Does
not
not
live in them,
end them.
right? Right.
So hopefully we attend a church, we go to a church and participate in the church where these truths,
Uh,
these old truths are told afresh.
yeah. Yeah.
Because I tell
Yeah.
you one thing, Ken,
Yeah.
man, now that I've gone back to church, I just keep getting convicted about the hatred inside of me
Yeah.
and how it can come out with Trump, and I can say things that I
Yeah.
wouldn't want anybody else to hear, and sometimes my wife doesn't want to hear them. But
Yeah.
I'll speak them, or I definitely think and feel them on the inside.
Yeah.
And it's just like, wow, the conviction of love your enemy, love your enemy. It's just like, it really stretches me, man. And
Yeah.
I'm sure for all of us, if we're dialed into that. Ken,
And
yeah, go ahead.
Doug, let me just say,
Please do.
I would hope that in every church that the conversation that you and I are having, that those conversations could be modeled in small groups, and that we come with the deep questions, because I think all of us have deep questions, that we sit in a space on Sunday and we hear the preacher preach, and and we leave still with those deep questions unanswered, right?
Yeah.
And so to find spaces, to create spaces where we can come and ask those questions and be assured that we will condemned, we will not be shamed, but that we can ask those questions. And because we cannot be fully human beings by ourselves, it takes a community, right? God created us in community. God created us to be in community. I hear people will say, well, I don't need the church. I can
Hmm.
watch television, right? Yeah, you can. The television can't talk back to you. The preacher on that screen can't talk back to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Gosh, Ken, I'm sad to see us come to an end. And would you, at some other time, would you come back?
I'd love to. I'd
Mm.
love to. Yeah.
I'm going
Yeah.
to reinstate what we used to do, what I call the round tables, where I would I'd get to know somebody individually, like I'm getting to know you, and we do the podcast, and then I would begin to, and I love doing this. I could do this all day. I wouldn't be able to put any food on the table with it, but I love doing it. And that is, I'm quite good at spotting. I don't know how else to say it, but I'm pretty darn good at spotting talent.
Yeah.
And then I love to put the right people together at a
Yeah.
table, if you will, the richness that comes from that. So I'm thinking of you, and I've already got somebody else in mind that I would put at the table.
Yeah.
Would you come back for one of those?
I'd love to.
Wow, wow.
Yeah. I'd love to. Yeah.
And so in the ministry that you continue to do now, you no longer are in Milwaukee. You live in the state of Illinois, if I understand things
Right.
correctly, but the
Right.
state line between Missouri and Illinois is not far away.
No,
Okay. And you travel. I
I
think you've
do.
got it. You've got an
I do.
international trip coming up that we got this podcast in right before you take off for
Yeah. But
you're
that's
going
that's that's for fun. That's to be with my family.
you're going to Japan.
Yeah. Yeah. So our
Wow.
youngest son and his wife they're living in Japan for a year.
Wow. 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 Have you been to
Yeah.
Japan before?
I've not been to Japan, but I was in Vietnam and
Mm.
Hong Kong and Korea last November.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow. Are you looking forward to this Japan trip?
I am. I
Wow.
am. I
That's
am.
fantastic.
Yeah.
My father took me on a work trip with him, and I carried his bags, and we went to China, and we went to
Yeah.
Japan on the same business vacation. It wasn't a vacation; it was a work time for my dad. I just tagged along, but we spent some time in Tokyo, and wow,
Yeah.
I didn't see the country of Japan, but Tokyo blew my mind.
Yep.
So, can people, of course, tell the title of your book is Us or
Yeah.
US?
Yeah, The Resurrection of American Terror, and you can actually order that through Amazon. If
Perfect.
and you can also have it ordered through a local bookstore.
That's great. That's great.
And then if you like to learn more, you can also go to my blog. It's entitled Kenneth's Musings.
Hmm.
Um,
Right on.
yeah, so I try to write weekly.
That's wonderful. And then
Yeah,
how often do you, is it the term the old itinerant preacher? How often do you uh, make a trip somewhere and like you get invited and it's either because people know Ken Walker or somebody meets you like me and says, "Wow, would you come to my church and see if you preach?" Do you accept those kind
yeah,
of invitations?
I do. In fact, I was 3 weeks ago, I was in Los Angeles preaching at a United Methodist church and then having a book discussion, 50 people
Oh,
in a conversation. So that was really powerful. And then I just got an invitation to come back to Los Angeles for a theological conference with the Evangelical Lutheran Church. And that's
wow.
going to be in November.
So there's work to do.
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
work to do.
yeah.
I'm going to end our time. It just popped in my head, and I think it's really appropriate as an ending. Is there anything else that you want to say, Ken, before I kind of end us in a blessing?
I'm good. So what you didn't read in my bio is so I have 5 grandkids, and they are the apple of my eye. Yeah.
And I love what you said earlier, the language you used around. Did you say the Spirit is all over this? We're all.
Yes.
I love
Yes.
that.
Yes.
I really, really love that phrasing. The
Yeah.
Spirit is just all over this. I love
Yeah.
that. Person who's had a significant impact in my life, and I was so honored and gifted with a friendship, Walter Brueggemann.
Yes.
And Walter just passed, and
Yes.
I've got a list of people that I grieve, and now that's come on my list. From his book Finally Comes the Poet.
Hmm.
Remember when I read this sentence and I talked to Walter and I said, Walter, what of all the books you've written, do you have a favorite?
Yeah.
He said, well, Prophetic Imagination is my most successful book, and that's what
Yeah.
everybody seems to. But he said, my favorite book that I ever wrote at that point, anyways, was Finally Comes the Poet. And I said,
Yeah.
Walter, man,
Yeah.
not only do we share the same birth date, not the
Yeah.
same year,
Yeah.
but the same birthday, March 11th. But I said, that's my favorite book. Well, there's a
Yeah.
sentence in there, and I want to close this with the sentence. Walter says this: it is in the reality of being loved and reloved, treasured, trusted, summoned, and gifted that we become free enough to be the children of God,
Hmm.
freed for life with God. Love that.
That was the first book that I read of his.
Ken,
Yeah.
this has been really a gift. I want to say thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Doug.
you. Thank you very, very much. And as you take off for Japan, have a fabulous trip.
Thank
And
you.
you and I will be in touch, and you'll be able to take this podcast, as we said earlier. There's no copyright on it. This is a shared ownership, if you will. You send it out to whoever you want to send it out to or not. And then,
Yeah.
of course, I'll post it on Facebook and I'll send it to a few people. And then we're going to have Ken Wheeler come back because we're going to have a roundtable discussion. So stay with me as I hit the stop button and everything
All right.
uploads. And
Okay.
bless you, Ken.
Same to you, Doug. It's been an honor.